The universe operates on principles. Starfleet believed it understood. Physics, chemistry, the measurable interaction of matter and energy across the vast tapestry of space. Sensor arrays aboard the USS Enterprise D could detect a cloaked Romulan warbird at 3 light-years, map the subatomic structure of a neutron star, and catalog the biological signature of a life form down to its mitochondrial rhythm. Captain Jean-Luc Picard had stood on the bridge of the most sophisticated vessel in Starfleet history and faced Q, the Borg, temporal anomalies, and gods who were merely powerful aliens wearing the costumes of mythology. He believed, with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen nearly everything, that the universe rarely produced something truly inexplicable. He was wrong. It began at 0347 hours, ship's time, when the Enterprise D was conducting a routine stellar cartography sweep of the Viridian Corridor, a sparsely populated region near the border of Federation space, notable primarily for its unusual concentration of collapsed subspace pockets left over from an ancient stellar event. Lieutenant Commander Data, who required no sleep and therefore occupied the night watch with characteristic efficiency, was the first to register the anomaly. His positronic brain processed the incoming sensor data in 0.003 seconds and found it immediately contradictory. Curious, he said, to no one in particular, because the bridge was nearly empty at this hour and Data had long since stopped apologizing for narrating his observations aloud. The anomaly was a tear, not in normal space, but in something beneath it. Subspace, that invisible substrate through which warp fields propagated and subspace communications traveled, had developed a rupture approximately 40 meters across. The rupture itself was not unprecedented. What was unprecedented was what the rupture contained. A coffin. It was not a Federation design. It was not a Klingon design, nor Romulan, nor anything in the Federation's considerable xenoarchaeological databases. It was constructed of aged wood, dark, almost black, banded with iron that had oxidized to a deep reddish brown. Carvings covered its surface in patterns that Data's initial scan identified as neither mathematical nor decorative, but something occupying an uncomfortable space between the two. Symbols that seemed to shift position slightly each time the sensors swept across them, as though the object resisted precise measurement. The coffin measured 1.9 meters in length and produced no life signs on standard biosensors. It produced no life signs on the upgraded biosensors. Data activated 30 seconds later. It produced no life signs on the tertiary medical frequency scan he ran at Lieutenant Worf's insistence. After the Klingon arrived on the bridge 4 minutes into the situation, drawn by some instinct that the night watch's unusual silence had communicated more clearly than any alert. What the coffin did produce was an energy signature unlike anything in the Federation's records. Dark matter interactions. Yes, but structured, deliberate, as though something had once used the fundamental scaffolding of the universe's invisible mass as a power source and left residual impressions in the fabric of space itself, like footprints pressed into stone over millennia. Lieutenant Worf, Data said, I recommend we bring it aboard. Worf's expression communicated his opinion of this recommendation without requiring words. They brought it aboard anyway, because Picard had been roused from sleep by Data's priority communication and had listened to the full sensor report, standing in his quarters in a robe, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold, and had said, after a long pause, that his crew had learned to recognize as the moment when curiosity overrode caution. Transporter Room 3. Full containment protocols. I want a medical team and a security detail. Wake Counselor Troy. The containment bay on Deck 7 had been designed for exactly these situations. Unknown objects of potential xenobiological significance, quarantined behind Level 4. Force fields with atmosphere independently regulated and every surface coated in sensor-reflective material. The coffin sat in the center of the bay like an accusation. It did not move. It did not respond to hails. Data had attempted communication in 47 languages, including 3 that were considered extinct. It simply existed, with the patient and slightly contemptuous stillness of something that had been waiting for a very long time and had learned that waiting was simply what existence required. Counselor Deanna. Troy stood at the force field's edge and said nothing for almost 2 full minutes. Counselor, Picard said. There's something inside it, she said. Something alive. I think. She paused. It's dreaming. Whatever the object contained was dreaming deeply enough that its emotional signature registered to her betazoid senses as barely a whisper, but the content of those whispers made her wrap her arms around herself despite the bay's regulated temperature. Centuries of accumulated sensation, blood and fire, and the long, aching silence of a soul in voluntary exile. Grief so old it had become architectural, built into the very structure of a psyche as load-bearing walls are built into a fortress. And beneath the grief, something else. Something that was not quite human and not quite not. The coffin opened. It did not creak. There was no dramatic swing of a lid, no theatrical fog. The wood simply separated along its seam with a soft sound, like a book closing in reverse. And the figure inside sat upright, in a single fluid motion that suggested complete awareness despite having registered no biological activity moments before. He was tall, even seated, with long silver hair that fell across shoulders clad in armor that belonged to no civilization in the Federation. Database, dark metal, engraved with patterns similar to those on the coffin's exterior. His face was pale in the way that suggested not illness, but something older than illness. A biology that had simply decided it had no use for the pink warmth of circulating blood near the skin's surface. His eyes, when they opened, were gold. He looked at the force field. He looked at the sensor arrays embedded in the walls. He looked at Picard. I did not choose to come here, he said, in a voice that carried the quiet authority of someone who had spoken to kings and found them disappointing. His universal translator took 1.4 seconds to process a language it had never encountered, and then his words resolved into perfect, slightly archaic standard, as if the translator itself had decided to render them with appropriate dignity. Neither, Picard said, did we choose to find you. But here we both are. He straightened slightly. I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation Starship Enterprise. And you are? The figure regarded him with gold eyes that held the particular patience of someone who had outlived most of the questions they'd ever been asked. Alucard, he said, son of Dracula, and I would very much appreciate an explanation of where precisely I have arrived. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. Picard had developed, over decades of command, a particular skill for receiving extraordinary information without allowing his face to communicate the full weight of his reaction. It had served him well when Q first put humanity on trial. It had served him when he learned the Borg had a queen. It served him now, as he processed the name Alucard and the parentage that followed it. By doing what it always did, it bought him approximately 3 seconds of composed silence during which his mind moved very quickly indeed. Son of Dracula, he repeated, with the careful neutrality of a man who had studied enough Earth mythology to know precisely what that claim implied, and enough science to know that mythology and reality had a complicated relationship in a universe that contained wormhole aliens worshipped as gods. That is a significant claim. I do not make claims, Alucard said, from behind the force field. I make statements of fact. The distinction matters to me. Data, standing at the primary sensor console along the containment bay's wall, had not stopped scanning since the coffin opened. His head tilted at the precise angle that indicated he was processing something his databases found structurally challenging. Captain, he said, I am detecting biological readings consistent with human physiology in approximately 43% of the subject's cellular structure. The remaining 57% presents readings I cannot categorize with confidence. There are cellular processes occurring that require energy inputs I cannot identify a source for. Additionally, the subject's core body temperature is 18.2 degrees Celsius, which is inconsistent with either human life or conventional biological function, yet all neurological indicators suggest full consciousness and cognitive activity. He is alive, Troy said quietly, from Picard's left. Whatever the sensors say, He is completely, fully present. Worf, positioned near the bay entrance with 2 security officers at parade rest behind him, had not lowered his hand from the proximity of his phaser since Alucard had opened his eyes. The Klingons' assessment of threats operated on instinct first and sensor data second, and every instinct Worf possessed was currently delivering the same message with increasing volume. This being was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with weapons or tactical positioning and everything to do with something older and less quantifiable. He had felt something similar standing before a Borg drone for the first time. The sensation of encountering a predator that did not register you as a potential threat because it did not yet consider you significant enough to threaten. "The force field will not hold me," Alucard said. He was not threatening. He was informing, with the mild courtesy of someone pointing out that a door was unlocked. "I am remaining within it because I choose to. I would prefer that choice to be recognized as the gesture it is." Picard studied him for a moment. Then he looked at Troy, who gave him the small, almost imperceptible nod that meant, "He is telling the truth, and he is in control of himself." "Lower the force field," Picard said. "Captain," Worf began. "Mr. Worf." He has made a reasonable gesture. "We will respond in kind." Picard straightened his uniform jacket with the small, precise tug that his crew recognized as preparation. "Lower it." The field came down with a soft, harmonic tone. Alucard stepped forward and stopped at a distance that was neither aggressive nor retreating. The distance of someone who had spent centuries calibrating exactly how close to stand to beings he was not yet certain he trusted. He was taller than Picard by several centimeters, and the armor he wore, despite its age, showed no damage, no corrosion, no evidence of the centuries that his eyes quietly suggested he had accumulated. "You are not afraid," he observed, looking at Picard. "I've found fear to be a poor foundation for first contact," Picard said. "I prefer curiosity." Something shifted in the gold eyes. Not warmth, exactly, but a slight recalibration, as though Picard had said something that did not fit the expected pattern and Alucard was updating his assessment accordingly. "A reasonable philosophy," he said. "Where am I?" "You are aboard the Federation Starship Enterprise, currently in the Viridian Corridor, approximately 40 light-years from Earth." Picard paused. "The year, by Earth's calendar, is 2367. Alucard absorbed this information with the stillness of someone who had received news of catastrophic temporal displacement before and had learned that visible distress served no practical purpose. Only the slight tightening of his jaw communicated what the number meant to him. He had last been conscious, as best he could determine from the internal chronology of long hibernation, somewhere in what the humans of his world had called the early 19th century. He did not say this. Instead, "Earth exists here." "It does," Picard said. "It is one of the founding worlds of the United Federation of Planets, a democratic alliance of over 150 civilizations." He watched Alucard's face carefully. "You know of Earth." "I have spent considerable time there," Alucard said, and the weight behind those words suggested that considerable was doing significant labor in that sentence. "Though not this Earth, I think. The Earth I knew had no starships." "Dr. Crusher," Picard said, activating his comm badge. "I need you in Containment Bay 7. Bring a full medical tricorder and an open mind." Beverly Crusher arrived 7 minutes later, reviewed Data's sensor readings in the corridor before entering, and walked into the bay with the expression of a physician who had treated Klingon physiology, Vulcan neurochemistry, and the android Data's positronic brain, and had therefore developed a professional policy of refusing to be surprised by biology. She stood before Alucard and ran her tricorder in a slow arc. "Your cellular structure is genuinely unlike anything in our medical database," she said, with something approaching appreciation. "The human component is clear enough. But the other half, these readings here, it's as though your cells are drawing energy from a source. My instruments can detect the effect of, but not the source itself." "I am Damper," Alucard said. "Half human, half vampire. The energy you cannot source is drawn from what my father's kind would call the dark current, the animating force that sustains the undead. In this universe, I suspect it functions differently than it does in mine." Crusher looked at Picard. Picard looked at Data. Data looked at his tricorder. "Fascinating," Data said, and meant it entirely. The observation lounge on deck 2 had hosted debates about the nature of life before. Data had once sat at that long table and argued, with quiet dignity, for his own personhood before a Starfleet adjudicator. The question of what constituted a life form deserving Federation rights and protections had been wrestled with across that polished surface in discussions that sometimes lasted until the ship's artificial dawn cycled through the viewports. But those discussions had always operated within a framework that Starfleet's philosophers and legal theorists had constructed over generations of encountering the strange and the new. They had categories, taxonomies, precedents. Alucard did not fit any of them. He sat at the table now, in the chair that guests of distinction typically occupied, across from Picard, with Data to the captain's right and Troy to his left, and Worf stationed near the door with the specific quality of stillness that meant he was ready to move in any direction at a moment's notice. Alucard had declined the offer of refreshment with a small, dry smile that suggested he found the gesture more amusing than offensive. He had, however, accepted the offer to be free of the containment bay, which Picard took as meaningful. "Let me understand your situation as precisely as I can," Picard began, with the methodical care of a man who had learned that precision in first contact prevented the categories of misunderstanding that got people killed. You entered a voluntary state of extended hibernation in your own universe. In a time period roughly analogous to Earth's early 19th century, you were drawn from that hibernation into this universe through a subspace rupture that neither of us caused or anticipated. You are the half-human son of a being your world considered the lord of vampires, and your primary motivation, prior to this displacement, was the protection of humans from supernatural threats, including, specifically, your father. That is accurate, Alucard said. You fought against your own father, Troy said. Not a question. She was reading the emotional resonance beneath the words, the vast complicated weight of that history pressing against the surface of his composure like water behind old stone. I did, Alucard said. He looked at her directly. You sense emotions. I'm Betazoid, she said. Half Betazoid. I feel what others feel, though I cannot read specific thoughts. Something moved in his expression, not discomfort, but recognition. Half and half, he said. You understand, then, what it is to belong entirely to neither side of what you are. Troy held his gaze for a moment. Yes, she said simply. I do. The observation lounge was quiet for a beat. The deep, comfortable silence of a starship at warp, the slight vibration of the engines, transmitted through the hull as a feeling more than a sound. Through the viewport, stars streaked past in the long, bright lines of warp travel, and Alucard watched them with the particular attention of someone cataloging an entirely new category of experience. The question before us, Data said, with the gentle inevitability of someone who had been waiting to introduce a necessary complication, is one of Federation legal standing. I have reviewed the relevant statutes and precedents since your arrival, and I find the situation presents genuine complexity. He folded his hands on the table in a gesture he had learned conveyed thoughtful engagement. Federation law recognizes sentient life forms of all biological classifications as entitled to certain fundamental protections. However, several aspects of your physiology and abilities fall outside existing frameworks in ways that create legal ambiguity. Elaborate, Picard said. Alucard's ability to sustain himself requires, in his native universe, the consumption of blood from living beings, Data said, with the directness of someone who found euphemism inefficient. Federation law has no specific provision for this requirement. Additionally, his demonstrated ability to alter his physical form, pass through solid matter in certain states, and exert direct physiological influence over other beings, abilities we have not yet fully cataloged, raises questions about containment, consent, and the safety of the crew that cannot be resolved by existing precedent. I do not feed on sapient beings, Alucard said. His voice carried no defensiveness, only the flat certainty of a principle so deeply held it had ceased to require emphasis. I have not done so in centuries. It is a line I drew and have not crossed. I believe you, Picard said. And he did. Troy's expression confirmed it. But belief and legal framework are different instruments. And I have a crew of over 1,000 people whose safety is my responsibility. I am not questioning your character. I am trying to understand your situation accurately enough to act with appropriate care. Alucard regarded him for a long moment. You are more careful than most men with authority, he said. Most men with authority have already decided what I am. Before the conversation begins, what do you believe you are? Picard asked. The question landed in the room with unexpected weight. Alucard did not answer immediately. He looked at his hands, pale, long-fingered, utterly still on the table in a way that human hands never quite were. The small unconscious movements of circulation and nerve impulse absent. I am the son of a monster, he said finally, who chose to be something else. What that something else is called depends on who is doing the naming. He raised his gold eyes to Picard. In my world, most would call me a monster also. They would be wrong, but I have stopped expecting accuracy from fear. In this world, Picard said carefully, we would call you a sentient being of unknown classification, entitled to the same consideration we extend to any life form until evidence suggests otherwise. He paused. That is not nothing. No, Alucard said, and something in his voice shifted almost imperceptibly, not softened. Exactly, but adjusted, the way a blade is adjusted. In a grip when fighting is no longer the immediate expectation. It is not nothing. Data had continued scanning throughout the conversation, and now he looked up from his tricorder with the expression he reserved for data that required immediate sharing. Captain, he said, I am detecting a modulation in Alucard's cellular dark energy signature. It appears to be strengthening. Whatever dimensional interference was dampening. His abilities upon arrival appears to be gradually resolving as his physiology acclimates to local subspace conditions. Picard absorbed this. How long until full acclimation? At current rate, Data said, approximately 72 hours. Picard looked at Alucard. Alucard looked back at him with the patient, slightly melancholy, gold eyes of someone who had been a problem requiring solving for most of his existence and had made his peace with it. Then we have 72 hours, Picard said, to figure out what comes next. The Tal Shiar did not announce itself. That was, in many ways, the most accurate summary of the organization's entire philosophy. The Romulan Empire's intelligence apparatus operated in the spaces between announcements, in the silences that other powers filled with diplomacy and declaration. Where the Federation sent ambassadors, the Tal Shiar sent listeners. Where the Klingons sent warriors, the Tal Shiar sent shadows. And in the cold, information-saturated void of interstellar space, shadows moved faster than either. Subcommander Verine had been monitoring Federation subspace communications from the listening post embedded in an asteroid cluster at the Viridian corridors edge for 11 weeks when the anomaly occurred. Her post was small, 3 operatives, a cloaked sensor array of considerable sophistication, and the particular kind of patience that the Tal Shiar cultivated in its field. Agents the way a gardener cultivates something, slow-growing and sharp. She had been expecting nothing more interesting than routine cartography, data, and the occasional encrypted Starfleet communique about Cardassian border tensions. What she received instead, intercepted from the Enterprise DS internal sensor logs, during a momentary shield fluctuation caused by the subspace rupture itself, was something that made her sit very still for a long time before composing her report. An immortal being, shape-shifting, impervious to conventional damage, energy signatures that bypassed every known weapon classification. Aboard the Federation's flagship, uncontained, in conversation with Picard himself, her report to Romulus took 6 hours to transmit. Through the required relay encryption, the response took 4. It contained 3 words in High Romulan that translated, roughly, as acquire at any cost. Aboard the Enterprise, the 72-hour acclimation window had reached its 31st hour, and Alucard had spent most of it in a state of controlled exploration that the crew had observed with the mixture of scientific fascination and carefully managed unease that characterized Starfleet's best response to the genuinely unknown. He had walked the corridors with Data as a companion, the android being, as Picard noted with dry appreciation. ideally suited to the task of accompanying someone who did not need sleep, did not require food, and had a history of making humans uncomfortable simply by existing. They had found, in each other's company, something that functioned as mutual recognition without quite resolving into warmth. You experienced the world without the biological imperatives that govern organic life, Alucard had observed, during a late-watch walk through the Arboretum on Deck 17, where the ship's cultivated plants provided the closest approximation of an outdoor environment available at warp. That is correct, Data said. I process sensory input and generate responses, but I do not feel hunger, fatigue, or the biochemical states that humans describe as emotion, though I have a functional analog that influences my behavior in similar ways. He paused. You also operate outside many of those imperatives. I feel them, Alucard said, looking at a climbing vine that reminded him, faintly and painfully, of the gardens at Castlevania. I simply do not require them. The hunger is present. I have chosen not to answer it in the ways my nature suggests. He touched a leaf with one finger. Choice, I have found, is the only meaningful distinction between what I am and what my father was. Data considered this with the focused attention he gave to statements that contained more information than their surface suggested. Your father chose differently. My father chose power over mercy, dominion over coexistence. Alucard withdrew his hand from the vine. He was not incapable of love. He loved my mother. That capacity did not prevent what he became. He looked at Data with gold eyes that held something ancient and specific. You think about what you are capable of becoming. I can see it in how carefully you phrase things. I think about what I am capable of, Data agreed. The distinction between capability and choice is one I find significant. It is the only significant distinction, Alucard said, for any being with power. It was during the 34th hour that the Romulan warbird decloaked. It appeared off the Enterprise's port bow at a distance of approximately 200 kilometers, close enough to be aggressive, far enough to be deniable as accident if diplomacy required it later. The bridge went to yellow alert in the same moment Worf's hand found his console. The warbird was a Deridex-class vessel, massive and predatory, in the way that Romulan design philosophy consistently achieved. Things built to suggest that the people who made them had thought carefully about making you afraid and had succeeded on purpose. They're hailing us, Lieutenant Worf reported, with the specific tone that meant he found the hail presumptuous. Picard straightened in his command chair. On screen, the Romulan commander who appeared was a woman of middle years with the angular features and disciplined composure, characteristic of her species. Officer class. She wore no Tal Shiar insignia. They never did in official communications, but Picard recognized the particular quality of her stillness as intelligence-trained, rather than military-trained. There was a difference, and he had learned to read it. Captain Picard, she said, I am Commander Sareth of the IRW Endless Dark. We have detected an anomalous energy signature aboard your vessel consistent with an unclassified life form of significant strategic interest. The Romulan Star Empire requests the opportunity to study this life form jointly with the Federation. That is a considerable request to make without prior diplomatic arrangement. Picard said pleasantly. We are making it now, Sareth said, with the smile that Romulans used the way humans use the word. Unfortunately, to soften something that was not actually soft. We would prefer cooperation to alternatives. In the observation lounge, where Alucard had been brought when yellow alert sounded, Picard having decided that a being of his capabilities required forewarning rather than surprise. He stood at the viewport and looked at the warbird's vast green mass hanging in space. His expression was not afraid. It was recognizing. They want me, he said. They want what they think you are, Picard said, having come to stand beside him. A weapon, an asset, something to be acquired. I have been wanted in those ways before, Alucard said quietly. The warbird's running lights pulsed slowly in the dark, by things considerably more frightening than that ship. He turned to look at Picard. What will you tell them? That you are a sentient being aboard my ship, Picard said, and that the Federation does not negotiate the transfer of persons. He held Alucard's gaze. Unless you wish otherwise. Alucard looked back at the warbird for a long moment. Something moved behind his gold eyes, the calculation of someone who had spent centuries making decisions about which battles to fight and which to refuse. I do not, he said, but I suspect they will not accept that answer. No, Picard agreed. They rarely do. Commander Sereth's second hail came 40 minutes after Picard's refusal, and it was shorter than the first. She did not repeat the request. She simply informed him, with the serene precision of someone delivering a weather report, that the Endless Dark would be maintaining its current position pending further diplomatic consultation, and closed the channel before he could respond. In Romulan diplomatic language, this translated approximately as, "We are not leaving. We are not attacking yet, and we would like you to spend the intervening time being uncomfortable about both of those facts." Picard spent the intervening time doing something more productive. He called a senior staff meeting. The observation lounge held them all. Riker leaning back in his chair with the carefully relaxed posture that meant he was thinking hard. Troy with her hands folded and her attention divided between the room and something internal. Data presenting sensor analysis with the methodical thoroughness that made his briefings simultaneously comprehensive and slightly exhausting. Worf radiating controlled displeasure at approximately everything. Crusher reviewing her medical findings on a PADD, and LaForge with the expression of an engineer who had encountered something that violated his understanding of how the universe worked and was personally offended by it. Alucard sat at the table's end. Picard had invited him deliberately, a choice that Worf had communicated his opinion of through precisely calibrated silence, and listened with the stillness of someone accustomed to rooms in which important decisions were being made about him in his presence. "The Romulans won't wait indefinitely," Riker said. "Sereth has Tal Shiar written all over her. This isn't a military operation. It's an acquisition mission with a warbird for insurance." "Agreed," Picard said, "which means she has specific objectives and specific constraints. She cannot simply attack us without creating an incident that the Romulan Senate would have to answer for. But she also cannot leave without what she came for, or the Tal Shiar will want to know why. She will attempt alternative methods," Data said. Historical Tal Shiar operational patterns suggest infiltration, subversion of crew members, or the introduction of technical vulnerabilities as preferred approaches when direct confrontation is diplomatically inadvisable. "I want security protocols elevated on all transporter rooms," Picard said, "and I want a continuous sensor sweep for any Romulan transport signatures, cloaked shuttles, or communication attempts directed at individual crew members." He looked at Worf. "Your department, Mr. Worf." Worf nodded with the satisfaction of someone being given a task perfectly suited to their current emotional state. "There is a secondary concern," LaForge said, pulling up a holographic display above the table center. The display showed a schematic of Alucard's energy signature, the dark, structured readings that had resisted categorization since his arrival. "I've been going over Data's scans, and there's something I want to flag. This energy, whatever it is, whatever dimension it comes from, it's been getting stronger at a consistent rate since he woke up, which we knew. But what I've just identified is that it's also been interacting with the ship's systems in ways that are subtle enough that we almost missed them." "Interacting how?" Riker asked. The holodeck on deck 11 ran a self-initialization sequence at 0200 hours with no user input. Replicator Unit 7 Alpha produced an output that didn't match any request in the system log. It created something that looked like a piece of iron. Old design, no functional purpose aboard a starship, and 3 of the EPS conduits in the section of the ship closest to where Alucard has been spending most of his time are running at slightly elevated energy transfer rates that I can't account for with standard load calculations. LaForge looked at Alucard directly, with the straightforward manner of an engineer who found politeness less useful than accuracy. "I don't think you're doing it deliberately, but I think your presence is affecting our systems in ways we don't fully understand yet." Alucard absorbed this without visible distress. "The dark current," he said. "It is responsive to proximity and unconscious intention. In my world, it saturates the environment around beings like me. In this universe, it appears to be seeking analogous channels." He looked at the holographic display. Your ship's energy systems are the closest equivalent it can find. Can you control it? Crusher asked. I can attempt greater conscious regulation, Alucard said. I cannot guarantee complete suppression. The acclimation process is not entirely within my direction. He looked at LaForge. I will make the attempt. If specific systems show further anomalous behavior, I would ask to be informed. LaForge nodded, with the expression of an engineer accepting an imperfect solution because no perfect solution was currently available. Fair enough. Picard let the moment settle before moving forward. There is a larger question we need to address. Alucard's presence aboard this ship has attracted Romulan attention. It will attract others. The subspace rupture that brought him here was detectable. Any faction with sufficient sensor capability in this region will have logged the event. We are currently the most interesting thing in this corridor, which is not a position I am comfortable maintaining indefinitely. He looked around the table. We need to determine two things: how to return Alucard to his own universe, and what to do in the interim if that proves more complicated than we would like. The subspace rupture has already closed, Data said. I have been modeling the dimensional mechanics since arrival, and I believe a controlled recreation of the rupture is theoretically possible, but would require a precise replication of the original dark energy configuration that I do not yet have sufficient data to attempt. My current estimate for achieving the necessary understanding is between 6 and 14 days. 14 days. The number moved around the room like a stone dropped in water, its ripples touching everyone differently. Riker glanced at Picard with the look that meant a lot can happen in 14 days. Worf's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Alucard said nothing. He was looking at the holographic display of his own energy signature, the dark structured light of it, rotating slowly above the table, beautiful in its way, and entirely illegible to every instrument the Federation possessed. 6 to 14 days, he said quietly. I have waited longer. He looked up at Picard. I would ask one thing, in the interim. Ask, Picard said. Do not treat me as cargo to be managed, Alucard said. I will cooperate with your protocols. I will attempt to control the effects of my presence on your systems. I will answer your questions honestly. In return, I ask to be treated as what I am, a being capable of reason and choice, rather than what your sensors say I might be. The observation lounge was quiet for a moment. Then Picard said, with simple and complete directness, that was never in question. Q arrived as Q always arrived, at precisely the moment most calculated to be inconvenient. He materialized in the center of the bridge during Alpha Shift, wearing the uniform of a Starfleet admiral with the particular satisfaction of someone who had chosen the costume, specifically because he knew how much it irritated the people who had earned theirs. He appeared in the command area between Picard's chair and the con station, close enough that Ensign Rowe, who was covering the con that morning, physically startled and knocked her elbow against her console. Hugh looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been handed a small gift. Oh, don't mind me, he said. Carry on. Pretend I'm not here. He paused. Actually, don't. I find being ignored exhausting, and I've had a very busy week. Hugh. Picard said the name the way other men said words that weren't permitted in polite company. Jean-Luc. Hugh spread his arms in an expansive gesture of greeting that managed to suggest he was welcoming Picard onto his own bridge. You look well. Slightly tired around the eyes, which I find gives you a distinguished quality, like a painting that has been authentically aged. He turned, slowly, taking in the bridge with the theatrical appreciation of a theater critic settling into his seat for a performance. He'd arranged himself. His gaze moved past Worf. The ever-reliable Klingon scowl. How I've missed it. Past Data. Still processing the universe 1 decimal point at a time. How charming. And then stopped. Alucard was standing near the aft science station, where he had been observing Data's dimensional modeling work for the past 2 hours. He had heard Q materialize with senses that did not require facing the sound's direction to locate it precisely, and had turned to watch the new arrival with the specific quality of attention he reserved for things that were not what they appeared to be. Q looked at Alucard for a long moment. Then, for the first time in Picard's considerable experience of Q's visits, Something crossed the omnipotent being's face that was not performance. It was brief, a flicker of genuine assessment, the look of something immortal, encountering something it had not entirely anticipated, before the mask of amusement resettled. "Well," Hugh said, softly and with unusual sincerity. "Now isn't that interesting?" He crossed the bridge toward Alucard with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never needed to consider whether an approach was safe. Alucard watched him come without moving, without the slight preparatory stillness that preceded action, simply watching, and Q stopped at a distance that was, Picard noted, slightly farther than Q typically stood from anyone, as though some instinct, even in an omnipotent being, had made a small automatic adjustment. "You're not from here," Q said. "No," Alucard said. "Not just not from the Federation. Not from this universe at all." Q tilted his head. "I can see the seams where you don't quite fit. The dimensional signature. Like a piece from a different puzzle forced into this one. It almost works. But the edges are wrong." He smiled. And this smile was different from his usual performances. Smaller. More genuine. Which made it somehow more unsettling. "I've been watching this ship for a day and a half, trying to decide whether to be interested. I've decided to be interested. I am not entertainment," Alucard said. "No," Hugh agreed, surprisingly. "You're not. That's what makes you interesting." He turned to Picard, with the brisk energy of someone moving to the main point of a meeting. "Jean-Luc, do you know what you have here? An individual deserving of respect and assistance," Picard said evenly. "Which is what we're providing. How Federation of you." Hugh clasped his hands behind his back and began to pace. The slow, deliberate pacing of a lecturer who enjoyed the sound of his own footsteps. "What you have here is a being who chose his own nature against every biological imperative that nature imposed, who looked at what he was made to be and said, with considerable personal cost, no." He stopped pacing and looked at Picard. "Do you understand how rare that is? In any universe." "I understand it perfectly," Picard said. "It's called character. It's called something considerably more difficult than character," Hugh said. And for a moment the flippancy was entirely absent, replaced by something that sounded, improbably, like respect. Character is choosing well when choosing well is possible. What he did, what he continues to do, every moment of his existence, is choose well when his very nature argues against it constantly. He looked back at Alucard. "Every cell in that complicated body of yours is an argument for something you've decided not to be. That is not character. That is will. And will, in my considerable experience, is considerably rarer." Alucard regarded Q with gold eyes that had seen enough of power to be unimpressed by its volume and were therefore able to assess its content more accurately. "You speak as though you understand the experience," he said. "You do not. Understanding requires having felt the argument from the inside." Q was quiet for a moment. It was, by Picard's count, the fourth time in all his encounters with Q that the entity had been rendered briefly quiet by something immortal said. "Fair," Q said finally. "Entirely fair." "Why are you here?" Picard asked. "Because something unprecedented has arrived in my neighborhood, and I prefer to examine unprecedented things personally, rather than read about them in the cosmic equivalent of a report." Q straightened his admiral's uniform with a small, precise gesture. "And because I want to propose a test." "Absolutely not," Picard said. "You haven't heard it yet. I don't need to. Your tests have a consistent track record of endangering my crew and I find the pattern exhausting. This test," Hugh said, with exaggerated patience, "does not endanger your crew. It concerns only our silver-haired guest and a question I find genuinely unresolved." He looked at Alucard. "You have spent centuries choosing humanity over your darker nature. You have done so in a world that provided constant, immediate, visceral reasons to make the other choice. My question is whether you can make the same choice here. In a universe where the darkness you carry has no name, no mythology, no cultural weight, where no one fears you for what you are, because they don't know what you are." Hugh paused. "Does the choice still mean the same thing when no one understands what it costs?" The bridge was very quiet. The hum of the engines filled the silence. Alucard looked at Q for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was steady, in the way of something that has been tested so many times that steadiness has become structural rather than performed. The choice means the same thing, he said, because I am the one making it. Q smiled. This time it reached something that might, in a being of his nature, have been called his eyes. Good answer, he said, and vanished. The Borg cube dropped out of transwarp at 0619 hours. And the Enterprise's red alert klaxon filled every corridor, with the specific quality of urgency that the crew had learned to associate with the possibility that today might be the day the universe stopped being survivable. It was a single cube, which was, as Riker noted with the dark humor of experience, both the best and worst possible configuration. Best because a single cube was, theoretically, something the Enterprise could maneuver against. Worst because a single cube had assimilated civilizations, and the Borg did not send single cubes, unless they were confident a single cube was sufficient. They've locked a tractor beam on us, Worf reported, his voice carrying the controlled intensity of a Klingon who had decided that fear was a resource to be converted directly into combat readiness. Shields holding at 94%. They are not firing. They never fire first, Riker said, from his position at Picard's right. They talk first. The view screen filled with the Borg's transmission. Before anyone requested it, the collective simply broadcast it, because the concept of waiting to be acknowledged was a social convention that existed for the benefit of individuals, and the Borg had no patience for the inconveniences of individuality. We are the Borg. The voice was the layered, harmonic composite of 1,000 simultaneous speakers that managed to be both monotonous and deeply wrong in a way the human nervous system registered before the conscious mind caught up. Your biological and technological distinctiveness will be added to our own. Your culture will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile. Standard hail, Picard said to Worf, with the weariness of a man who had heard this particular greeting before from the inside. Tell them we are not interested. But the Borg's next transmission was not the standard follow-up. It was a modification, a specific addendum that made Data's head tilt sharply and brought Troy's hand to her mouth. We have detected an organism of unprecedented biological configuration aboard your vessel. This organism's distinctiveness is unlike any previously encountered. Assimilation of this organism will significantly advance the perfection of the collective. You will surrender this organism. Resistance is futile. In the brief silence that followed, every person on the bridge became simultaneously aware of Alucard, standing at the rear of the bridge, where he had come when red alert sounded, and of the particular quality of attention he was now directing at the view screen. It was not fear. It was something older and more considered than fear. The assessment of a being that had spent centuries evaluating threats and had developed a taxonomy of them sophisticated, enough to include categories that most beings never needed. They want me, he said, for the second time in 3 days, and with the same quiet absence of surprise. They want what they think assimilating you would give them, Picard said. Then they are making an error in calculation, Alucard said, that I have some experience correcting. The Borg dispatched a cutting beam 30 seconds after Picard's refusal not to destroy, but to carve a precise section from the Enterprise's secondary hull large enough to admit a boarding party. 4 drones materialized on deck, 9 through the breach before the emergency force field sealed it, and 4 more beamed directly through the Enterprise's shields using the Borg's characteristic ability to adapt to Federation defensive frequencies in real time. Worf led the security response personally, because there were situations in which a Klingon security chief, delegating the actual fighting, felt philosophically inconsistent. The phaser fire in the corridor outside Cargo Bay 3 lasted 40 seconds before the drones adapted to the frequency, and the phasers became decorative. Worf switched to a compression phaser rifle at a different setting, bought another 30 seconds, and then the drones adapted again. This was the Borg's fundamental tactical genius, not strength, not numbers, but the patience of a machine learning system with a galaxy-spanning database. Every weapon used against them became, within moments, a weapon they could ignore. Alucard arrived in the corridor before anyone had requested his presence, moving with the fluid speed of something that had decided where it needed to be without consulting the decision-making process that slower beings required. He looked at the 4 drones advancing on Worf's position and at Worf himself, who was recalibrating his rifle with the focused fury of a warrior. Being denied a fair fight. Stand aside, Alucard said to Worf. Worf, to his considerable credit, looked at Alucard for exactly 1 second, assessing, calculating, accepting, and stepped to the side of the corridor. What followed was not a battle in any sense. The Borg's tactical systems were designed to process. The drones reached for Alucard with assimilation tubules, the sharp, precise instruments of the collective's expansion, capable of delivering nanoprobes through any biological surface, and encountered something. Their adaptive algorithms had no category for. Alucard shifted, not metaphorically, not strategically. He simply became something other than a solid target. Missed. Briefly, filling the corridor with a cold that the environmental sensors registered as a 14-degree temperature drop, and then reforming behind the lead drone with a speed that the ship's internal sensors logged at 2.3 seconds for a displacement of 6 meters, but that felt, to the humans watching, like something that had happened between moments rather than during them. The dark energy that La Forge had been monitoring in the EPS conduits for 3 days surged. Every light in the corridor section dimmed simultaneously and then restored. Alucard's eyes in the dimness were the only consistent illumination, gold, focused, entirely calm. The drones attempted to adapt. Their nanoprobes required a biological surface to interface with, and the mist form provided none. Their tactical systems attempted to predict his reformation point and found that his movement patterns did not follow ballistic or biological logic, but something older and less mappable. They attempted to scan him for vulnerabilities and found that the dark energy permeating his cellular structure absorbed their scanning frequencies, the way a black body absorbs light completely, returning nothing useful. 3 drones were neutralized in 90 seconds. The 4th attempted a direct assimilation strike at the moment of reformation and got close enough that the tubules made contact with Alucard's left forearm. There was a sound, low, resonant, wrong, and the drone's assimilation systems shut down completely. Its nanoprobes, introduced into Alucard's cellular environment, encountered the dark current and stopped functioning. The Borg drone stood in the corridor for 2.7 seconds in a state its collective had never experienced. Complete disconnection from the hive mind. Isolated, silent, the link simply gone, dissolved by contact with something the nanoprobes could not categorize and therefore could not survive. Then it collapsed. Worf stared at the fallen drone, then at Alucard, who was examining his forearm with clinical detachment, watching the puncture sites from the tubules close and seal with the unhurried efficiency of a biology that had decided wounds were temporary inconveniences. Your nanoprobes, Alucard said, to no one in particular, to the ship itself and the collective beyond it, do not function in the presence of what I carry. On the bridge, Data had monitored the entire engagement through internal sensors and was now running calculations with the intensity of someone who had just encountered a genuinely new variable. He opened a channel to Picard. Captain, he said, I believe I understand why the Borg sent only 1 cube. Picard looked at him. Explain. They did not know what Alucard was when they dispatched it, Data said. They are learning now, and I believe, based on the cube's current power signature fluctuations, that they are, for the first time in my experience of Borg tactical behavior, reconsidering. The cube had not fired, had not sent additional drones, was simply present in space off the Enterprise's bow, its vast geometric mass suddenly suggesting not confidence but something the Borg had never previously needed to demonstrate, because they had never previously needed it. Uncertainty. The Borg cube remained at station keeping for 4 hours and 17 minutes before it did something no one on the Enterprise's bridge had ever witnessed a Borg vessel do. It hailed them, not with the standard collective transmission, not the layered harmonic broadcast of 1,000 voices, delivering the assimilation greeting with the patient confidence of inevitability. This was different. A single frequency, narrowband, directed specifically at the Enterprise rather than broadcast into surrounding space. As though the collective, for the first time, wanted a private conversation. Picard took it in the observation lounge with Riker, Data, and Alucard present. Because whatever the Borg had to say after 4 hours of uncharacteristic silence seemed like information that required witnesses. The voice that came through was still composite, still the layered harmonic of many minds speaking as one, but something in its quality had changed. The absolute, frictionless certainty was gone, replaced by something that the universal translator rendered in standard with accurate but unsatisfying precision, the closest human emotional equivalent. Data suggested afterward in his log was something between compulsion and dread. We have analyzed the organism designated Alucard, the collective said. Its biological configuration is incompatible with standard assimilation protocols. Nanoprobe integration fails at the cellular interface. The energy medium permeating its physiology actively destroys nanoprobe function upon contact. Assimilation is not currently achievable. A pause that lasted 1.3 seconds, an eternity by Borg. Communication standards. We require understanding of this medium. You will provide data. You're asking, Riker said, with the expression of a man double-checking something he didn't expect to be true. We are requesting data transfer, the collective said. That's asking, Riker said. Picard held up a hand before Riker's observation could develop into something less diplomatically useful. The Federation does not provide data on individuals without their consent, he said. He looked at Alucard. This is your decision. Alucard was silent for a moment, studying the speaker through which the collective's voice emerged with the same focused assessment he brought to everything. Unhurried, layered, drawing conclusions from information that slower analysis would miss. What the Borg encountered in that corridor was not something I can explain in terms there science would find useful, he said finally. The dark current is not technology. It is not biology in the sense your instruments measure. It predates the categories they would use to contain it. He looked at Picard. Giving them data would give them words for something they cannot hold. It would not help them assimilate me. It might help them understand that they cannot, which could be valuable. You're suggesting we tell them why they failed, Data said, as a deterrent. I am suggesting that a being, which has never encountered a limit, might benefit from understanding that limits exist, Alucard said. Even the Borg, I think, are better served by accurate information than by the alternative. Picard considered this for a moment, then nodded. Data, prepare a summary of your findings on Alucard's cellular energy interaction with the nanoprobes. Factual? No. Speculation about potential countermeasures or vulnerabilities. Data compiled the summary in 40 seconds. Picard transmitted it. The Borg cube was silent for 6 minutes. Then, this data is insufficient for complete understanding. Yes, Picard said. It is. Some things are. Another pause. Then the tractor beam released. The cube's drives engaged. It moved away from the Enterprise at increasing velocity and jumped to transwarp. Without further communication, its vast geometric mass folding into the characteristic vortex and vanishing as completely as a thought abandoned. Riker watched the empty space where it had been. Did we just, he said slowly, teach the Borg humility? We provided accurate information, Data said. Whether the collective categorizes the resulting cognitive state as humility is beyond my ability to determine. The Romulan warbird had watched the entire Borg engagement from its position 200 kilometers off the Enterprise's port bow, and Sub-Commander Varine, observing through the endless dark's enhanced sensor array. From her position in Commander Saratha's tactical center, had spent those 4 hours revising her acquisition report with the focused efficiency of someone whose professional survival depended on accuracy. What she had initially characterized as a powerful but containable asset had revealed itself as something considerably more complex. The Borg's failure to assimilate Alucard was not, in her assessment, primarily a tactical finding. It was a philosophical one. The Borg assimilated everything. That was not hyperbole. It was the foundational premise of every strategic calculation. The major powers of the Alpha Quadrant made about the collective. Something the Borg could not assimilate was not merely powerful. It was categorically different from everything else in known space. Sarath had reached the same conclusion 4 minutes earlier and had already composed a revised transmission to Romulus. The response came back in 2 hours. The acquisition mandate stood, but the methodology was revised. Not capture. Recruitment. Sareth opened a channel to the Enterprise, not a hail to the bridge, but a directed communication to a specific comm badge, routed through a frequency variance she had identified in the Enterprise's communication array during the shield fluctuation 3 days prior. It was the comm badge of the crew member she had identified through careful behavioral analysis of intercepted internal communications as the most likely to carry a private conversation without immediately reporting it to Picard. Guinan's comm badge registered the incoming signal at 13:47 hours and 10 forward, and Guinan, who had been alive long enough to recognize a Romulan intelligence frequency the moment she heard one, did not answer it. She walked directly to the bar, poured herself a glass of water, and said quietly to the room, "They're trying to reach someone who isn't here." Alucard, who had been sitting at a corner table for the past hour in the particular quality of stillness that humans sometimes mistook for sleep, opened his gold eyes. "I know," he said. "I have been listening to their sensor sweeps for 2 days. They have been building a picture of this ship one transmitted frequency at a time." Guinan looked at him with the measured, unhurried attention she gave to everything. Of all the Enterprise's crew, she had been the least visibly affected by his arrival, partly because her own history with the Borg had recalibrated her sense of what constituted extraordinary, and partly because she possessed the particular quality of perception that recognized something ancient when it sat down at one of her tables. "You've been letting them," she said. It was not an accusation. "I have been observing what they choose to look for," he said. "What a hunter examines tells you more about the hunter than the prey." Guinan sat down across from him. This was unusual. She rarely sat with guests, preferring the slight elevation of the bartender's position that allowed her to see the room. Sitting across from Alucard felt, she decided, like the appropriate configuration. 2 very old things at a table, dispensing with the formalities designed for shorter lives. "What have you learned about them?" she asked. "That they are afraid," he said. "The Borg engagement changed their calculation. They came here expecting to acquire a weapon. They are now trying to understand whether the weapon can be aimed, or whether it aims itself." He looked at his hands on the table, pale. Still the small, closed puncture marks on his left forearm, the only evidence of the morning's events. "They will make contact soon. Through me, not through the captain. Will you tell Picard?" Alucard looked up from his hands. "I am telling you," he said. "Which is the same thing, I suspect." Guinan smiled, small, genuine, the smile of someone who had just been accurately read by something that bothered to look carefully. "It usually is," she said. Sareth made her move at 0230 hours. Ship's time, when the Enterprise's night watch reduced the bridge crew to its minimum configuration, and the corridors carried the specific quality of quiet that large vessels developed when most of their inhabitants were asleep. It was the hour that intelligence operatives across every spacefaring civilization had independently identified as optimal, not because security was absent, but because the gap between perception and response widened in the small hours in ways that training could narrow but not eliminate. 3 Romulan operatives materialized on deck 10 through a transport window. Varine had spent 4 days engineering a precise modulation of the Enterprise's shield harmonics that created a gap lasting exactly 1.8 seconds, sufficient for a targeted transport if the coordinates were accurate to the centimeter. They wore Federation crew uniforms replicated from intercepted visual data. Their universal translators had been preloaded with standard speech patterns, drawn from the same intercepts. They carried weapons modified to appear as standard-issue phasers at a casual glance. The operation had been planned with the thoroughness that the Tal Shir applied to everything it considered important, which was everything. They had been in the corridor for 11 seconds when Alucard stepped out of the shadows at the corridor's junction and looked at them. He had not been informed of their arrival. He had felt it, the cold, precise displacement of air that accompanied a transporter materialization, registered by senses, calibrated across centuries of hunting things that did not want to be found. He had been awake, as he was always awake during the ship's night hours, moving through the quiet corridors in the particular solitude he had learned to inhabit without allowing it to become something darker. He had felt the transport 30 meters away and had simply walked toward it. Because walking toward things that did not want to be found was, at this point, something close to reflex. The three operatives stopped. Their training covered most contingencies. It did not cover this, a pale figure with gold eyes standing at a corridor junction at 0230 hours, entirely unsurprised by their presence, wearing the expression of someone who had been expecting them and had found the waiting mildly tedious. "You are not crew," Alucard said. The lead operative, a young man whose Talshir training had been excellent and whose experience of things outside the Romulan Empire's comprehensive threat taxonomy was about to expand, significantly, reached for his modified weapon. Alucard was standing beside him before the weapon cleared its holster. Not in front of him, beside him, close enough that the operative could feel the absolute cold that radiated from Alucard's presence the way a fire radiated heat, the same principle operating in precise inversion. The weapon was in Alucard's hand. He examined it with the brief attention of someone identifying a tool he had no use for and set it down on the corridor floor with a soft, definitive sound. "I will not hurt you," he said, to all three of them, with the flat sincerity of a statement that did not require emphasis because it was simply true. "But I will ask you to accompany me to the bridge." Picard received the notification at 0247 hours and arrived on the bridge at 0251, still adjusting his uniform, to find three Romulan operatives seated in a row against the aft bulkhead under Worf's watchful and deeply satisfied supervision and Alucard standing at the viewscreen looking at the endless darks running lights in the dark. "They came for me," Alucard said, without turning. "Not to harm anyone aboard. To make contact. The violence was contingency, not intent." He turned. "I thought you should make that distinction." Before Mr. Worf's enthusiasm for classification took hold, Worf's expression suggested that he found the distinction less meaningful than Alucard did but was prepared to defer to the captain's judgment. Picard looked at the three operatives with the measured assessment of a man processing several things simultaneously: a diplomatic incident, a security breach, and the fact that the being responsible for resolving the immediate crisis had done so without injury to anyone, and had then immediately provided Picard with the information needed to handle it correctly. He filed each of these observations in their appropriate categories and addressed the most urgent. "Get me Commander Sareth," he said. Sareth appeared on the view screen with the composure of a Talshir officer who had been caught in an operation and had decided that composure was the only remaining asset worth protecting. "Captain Picard," she said. "Commander." Picard clasped his hands behind his back. "Your operatives are unharmed and will be returned to you via shuttle within the hour. I am logging this as an incursion into Federation space and a violation of the Treaty of Algeron, and transmitting my full report to Starfleet Command and the Romulan Senate." He paused. "I am also noting, for the record, that the individual your operatives were sent to contact has expressed no interest in Romulan recruitment and is aboard this vessel as a protected guest of the Federation." Another pause. "Is there anything else we need to discuss?" Sareth looked at him for a long moment. Then, very briefly, her eyes moved to Alucard, standing beside Picard with the stillness of someone who had already decided that this particular chapter was closing. Something in her expression shifted, not defeat exactly, but the specific recalibration of an intelligent person accepting that a situation has moved beyond the boundaries of their original plan. "No," she said. "I believe we are concluded." The channel closed. The Warbird's running lights shifted configuration as its engines powered up, and the endless dark turned away from the Enterprise with the deliberate dignity of a vessel choosing its own moment of departure. Within 4 minutes, it had jumped to warp and was gone. The crisis, such as it was, had resolved. But in the observation lounge at 0400 hours, with the stars outside the viewports returning to their stationary brilliance as the Enterprise resumed its own warp travel, Alucard sat across from Picard in the quiet that follows the closing of something significant. And the conversation they had was not about Romulans or Borg or the operational details of the past 5 days. It was about something older. You stopped them without harming them, Picard said. 3 trained operatives in a closed corridor. In the dark, with element of surprise. Yes, Alucard said. You could have done otherwise. Yes. Picard looked at him carefully. How often do you have to make that choice? The choice not to do what you could do. Alucard was quiet for a moment. Outside the viewport, stars moved past in the slow drift of warp travel, each one a sun around which other. Stories were occurring, with complete indifference to this one. Every moment, he said. Not dramatically, not with great internal struggle, the way the stories about beings like me tend to suggest. He looked at his hands. It is simply a choice that is always present. A door that does not lock, that I keep closed by choosing to keep it closed, rather than by any mechanism that would close it for me. That sounds exhausting, Picard said. It sounds like being alive, Alucard said. Most beings with genuine choices find the choosing exhausting. The ones who do not choose find other ways to be exhausted. He looked up at Picard. Your prime directive is a similar mechanism, I think. A door you keep closed by choosing to keep it closed, in full knowledge of what you could do if you opened it. Picard absorbed this. We do not always succeed, he said. Neither do I, Alucard said. The choosing matters anyway. They sat in the quiet for a while, the captain and the damper, the scientist diplomat and the ancient half-creature of darkness, in a shared silence that required no filling because they had both, in different ways and across very different centuries, learned that some understandings were better held quietly than explained. Then Data's voice came through the comm badge. Calm, precise, carrying the specific quality of controlled excitement that the android reserved for genuinely significant findings. Captain, I believe I have completed the dimensional modeling. I know how to bring Alucard home. The procedure required 12 hours of preparation and the willing cooperation of every major system on the Enterprise D. Simultaneously, a coordination of resources that LaForge described, with the understated precision of an engineer who had learned that dramatic language attracted questions he didn't have time to answer. As the most complicated thing I have ever asked this ship to do, and I once asked it to collapse a quantum filament. Data's dimensional modeling had identified the precise configuration of dark energy required to recreate the subspace rupture through which Alucard had arrived. The original rupture had been accidental, a confluence of natural subspace variance and the residual dimensional signature of Alucard's long hibernation, 2 improbable factors intersecting at a moment the universe had not planned and would not naturally repeat. Recreating it deliberately required the Enterprise to generate a controlled dark energy analog using the warp cores, matter-antimatter reaction modulated at specific frequencies, combined with a precisely timed burst from the deflector dish that would fold local subspace in the exact configuration needed to open a dimensional threshold. The threshold would remain stable for approximately 90 seconds. After that, the energy requirements exceeded what the Enterprise could sustain, without risking structural integrity, and the dimensional mathematics became, in Data's careful phrasing, non-trivially catastrophic. 90 seconds. Alucard had listened to the parameters, with the focused attention he gave to operational details, and had asked only one question. Will I arrive in my own time, or in this universe's equivalent of it? Data had paused for 1.1 seconds, his equivalent of a long hesitation. The dimensional threshold will return you to your universe, he said. The temporal coordinates are less precise. My best estimate places your arrival within a century of your original hibernation point, with a margin of error I cannot reduce below 40 years in either direction. Alucard had absorbed this with the stillness of someone for whom temporal imprecision was not an abstract inconvenience, but a lived reality, someone who had slept through centuries and woken to find the world rearranged around his absence. That is acceptable, he said, which, Picard noted privately, was either remarkable equanimity or a relationship with time so fundamentally different from human experience that the distinction between 40 years in either direction had ceased to be meaningful in the way it would be to anyone else at the table. The 12 hours of preparation had the particular quality of time that moves Differently, when something significant is ending. LaForge and his engineering team worked with focused intensity, running calculations and recalculating them, stress testing the warp core modulation sequences against every failure scenario they could model. Data moved between stations with the steady efficiency of someone who had done the mathematics so many times that he could hold the entire dimensional model in his positronic memory simultaneously and monitor its integrity in real time. The bridge operated at yellow alert. As a precaution, the energy requirements for the procedure would leave the Enterprise briefly vulnerable, and Worf had requested, with characteristic directness, that they at least be looking in the right direction if something chose that moment to be inconvenient. Alucard spent the 12 hours doing what he had done throughout his time aboard, moving through the ship with the quiet, observant presence of someone, building an internal record of a place they expected to remember for a long time. He spent an hour in the Arboretum. He sat with Guinan in 10 forward for 2 hours, during which she served him nothing, and they spoke in the unhurried way of two very old beings comparing notes on the experience of duration. He stood for a while on the holodeck with the program switched off, just the bare yellow grid of the inactive space and the hum of the ship around it, and seemed to find something in that emptiness that served whatever internal purpose the visit was meant to serve. He found Troy on deck 8, near the end of the preparation period, where she was sitting in one of the small observation alcoves that lined the ship's outer hull, with viewport panels offering an unobstructed view of the stars. She had been expecting him, in the way that empaths sometimes expected things, not through any specific premonition, but through the accumulated awareness of having spent 10 days in proximity to someone whose emotional landscape she had come to know well enough to predict its movements. "You're not afraid to go back," she said. "No," he said, sitting beside her. The stars outside were stationary. The Enterprise had dropped to impulse for the final preparation phase, and the universe had resolved from warp's bright streaking lines back into the fixed, patient points of real space. "I am not afraid of my world. I am familiar with its darkness." He looked at the stars. "I find I am something else about leaving this one." "What?" she asked. He considered the question with the honesty he had applied to everything. "Reluctant," he said finally, "which is not something I expected." He looked at her. "Your captain builds things around himself, loyalty, principle, genuine regard, without appearing to try. I have met very few humans who managed that." He paused. "Very few beings of any kind." Troy smiled. "He would be embarrassed to hear you say that." "I know," Alucard said. "That is part of what makes it true." At 1847 hours, the Enterprise moved to the designated coordinates, a point in space chosen for its distance from inhabited systems and its favorable subspace geometry, and began the procedure. The warp core modulation produced a sound that traveled through the ship's hull as a subsonic vibration rather than an audible tone, felt in the chest and the bones rather than heard, as though the ship itself was holding a note it had never held before. The deflector dish charged to 340% of standard output, and the space ahead of the Enterprise began to change, not visibly at first, then in ways the sensors logged before the eyes registered, and then in ways the eyes registered, with the specific wrongness of geometry that was no longer behaving according to its usual agreements. The threshold opened. It was not dramatic in the way that film and holodrama had trained generations of Starfleet officers to expect dimensional events to appear. It was a vertical seam in space approximately 3 meters across, and through it the sensors detected something that was not the vacuum of this universe, but the dimensional signature of somewhere else, somewhere ancient and darkened, saturated with the particular quality of energy that Alucard's cellular structure had been trying to recapitulate for 10 days in the inadequate medium of Federation subspace. Alucard stood at the threshold. They had positioned it off the port shuttle bay, accessible via EVA in the ship's environmental containment field, and the effect of proximity was immediate and visible. The dark current in his cellular structure responded to his home dimension the way a compass responds to magnetic north, with sudden, absolute certainty. His eyes brightened. The slight dimming of his presence that had characterized His entire time aboard, the subtle wrongness of something existing in a universe whose physics were not quite its own, resolved into something fuller and more complete. He turned to look at Picard, who stood beside him in an EVA suit with the dignified discomfort of a man who found spacewalks a poor substitute for a proper farewell, but had come anyway because the alternative was not coming. You have 90 seconds, Picard said. I require fewer, Alucard said. He looked at Picard for a moment, the gold eyes clear and direct, holding the particular quality of attention that meant he was committing something to the long memory he would carry across whatever centuries remained to him. You treat the unknown with curiosity rather than fear, he said. In my experience, that is rarer than it should be. It is what we try to do, Picard said. We do not always succeed. Neither do I, Alucard said. The trying matters anyway. He stepped through the threshold. The seam in space held for 11 more seconds, long enough for the sensors to confirm dimensional transition, long enough for LawForge to log a clean separation without cascade effects, long enough for everyone watching to understand that it was done, and then closed with the soft, definitive sound of a book closing, or a coffin lid settling into place, or the last page of a very long story reaching its final line. The stars outside were unchanged. The universe continued. The Enterprise hung in the quiet of open space with its systems returning to normal parameters one by one, each console's status light shifting from the yellow of elevated alert back to the steady green of a ship at peace with its immediate circumstances. Picard stood at the viewport for a long moment after the threshold closed, looking at the empty space where it had been. Captain, Worf said from the bridge, through the comm. All systems nominal. No anomalous readings. The Viridian corridor is clear. Thank you, Mr. Worf, Picard said. He did not move immediately. He stayed at the viewport a moment longer, with the expression of a man storing something carefully, not in a log or a report, but in the interior archive that every thoughtful person maintains of the experiences that change the shape of their understanding, without announcing that they are doing so. Then he turned and walked back to the bridge, because the stars did not stop needing exploration simply because one extraordinary encounter had ended, and the Enterprise had more of the universe left to examine. In the end, the Federation's records of those 10 days would be filed under the classification that Starfleet reserved for encounters that defied existing taxonomies: anomalous contact, dimensional origin, unresolved classification. Data's full sensor logs were archived in the Daystrom Institute, where xenobiologists and theoretical physicists would spend years attempting to model the dark current's properties from secondhand readings and reach conclusions that were technically accurate and experientially incomplete. The Romulan Senate quietly reprimanded Commander Sereth and more quietly retained her for future operations. The Borg Collective added a single notation to its vast accumulated record of encountered species, a notation without tactical recommendations, which was itself unprecedented. The collective's equivalent of admitting that some things fell outside the scope of what assimilation could address. Guinan, when asked by a junior crew member what she thought of the whole affair, said only that the most important things she had learned in her long life were that darkness was not the same as evil, that choosing well was harder than most beings admitted, and that the universe was considerably larger than any map of it. She then asked the junior crew member if they wanted something to drink, and the conversation moved on, as conversations in 10 Forward always did, towards something smaller and more immediate and no less significant for being so, somewhere beyond the threshold, in a universe of castles and darkness and the ancient war between humanity and what preyed upon it. A silver-haired figure stood in a world that knew his name and his nature and had decided what both meant long before he was born. He looked at the sky, different stars, the old familiar dark, and carried with him the memory of 10 days in a place where none of that history existed, where a starship captain had looked at him with curiosity rather than fear, and where the choice he made every moment of his existence had been recognized by at least one human across the vast improbability of two universes as what it actually was. Not monstrous, not miraculous, simply the most difficult and most necessary thing any being with genuine power could do: the choosing.